Good evening, everyone. I'm Agnes Dodds and your moderator for this evening's webinar on the Synod on Synodality, a new kind of church. I am tonight in Naarm, Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners whose lands have never been ceded. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and elders of other communities who may be with us today. I would like to begin with a short prayer and reflection. O God, who always walks with your people, bless and guide our conversation. Keep us anchored in your love. Open our minds and our hearts as we listen to each other. Give us the courage to pursue unity with respect. May we experience renewal in our church today and for generations to come. We ask this prayer through Jesus Christ, who in the power of the Holy Spirit continues to guide your church to the fullness of your kingdom, now and forever. Amen. Before I introduce our first speaker, a quick word on the format. We will hear from our two speakers for around 20 minutes each and then take questions from the Q&A function on your screen. We have a slightly unusual situation, so if you wish to address a question to a particular speaker, can you please address it to either Susan P or Susan S to save confusion. Our first speaker needs little introduction to those who have been following the progress of the Synod consultations. Susan Pascoe, AM, chairs Catholic Emergency Relief Australia and has held a number of senior roles in the church and government. She is a member of the Vatican Commission on Methodology, planning for the 2023 Synod. She will speak to us on that work and in particular the role of the Oceania consultation leading to the Instrumentum Laboris for the coming Synod. Please welcome Susan Pascoe.
Thank you, Agnes. And I feel like I should welcome all of the participants. We have in excess of 1,500 people joining us this evening, which gives an indication of the level of anticipation, I think, and interest in this initiative, which is a lengthy process in many ways to get us on a journey to a adjusted way of being church. What I want to do with you this evening, and the PowerPoint presentation will be presented to you, and you'll see if we look at the next slide that the session I'm going to do, I want to take us back a little bit to the context in which we're operating and look at the background to where we are right now, just prior to the assembly, which will occur in October, to look at some of the key milestones in this very unique synod. As Agnes said, to look in particular at the Oceania process, our own region, which was a really fascinating process, to look at the deliberations that resulted from that. So what were the people in this Pacific region saying, and what do they want to be taken to the Universal Church? To look then at the Instrumentum Laboris, which is the Latin word for the working document for the Assembly, and then how the 2023 Assembly is planned to be conducted. So if I move on then to the aims of this Synod in the next slide, and it's really simple in many ways, and that is to learn synodality. Pope Francis, who often speaks poetically, talks about synodality as a way of being church, as a journey, pilgrims on a journey, very much evocative of the language that came from Vatican II. And so when we talk about this particular synod, what we're really talking about is a process I think there's been much more of a focus in previous synods on the Episcopal Assembly, the bishops' meeting, but this one, all the lead into it, has been very significant. So if we look at the next slide, we'll also see that although at one level it's simple, it's all of the baptised, lay people, religious, priests, bishops, all of the baptised journeying together. It's an easy concept to put into words, but not as easy to put into practice because, of course, we have established patterns of behaviour, established cultures, established ways of doing things, and there'll be modifications, particularly if we're going to have a much greater involvement of all of the people of God. And note that this quote from the Pope was at the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops. If we move on from there and look at the background, what are some of the key milestones to date? There was an opening on the 10th of October 21. It's a much longer story, but I did go to that opening at a time when Australia was completely shut down. And it was an extraordinary time to be, I think, anywhere globally, but to be in Rome and in the Vatican. A week after, there was the formal opening of the discernment in local churches organised through dioceses. And that process went on until the 15th of August the following year. So although it was intended to finish around Easter in April, there was a strong request from the local churches that more time was given. When all of those submissions that resulted from that process were gathered together, there was a group that were asked to Rome, to a monastery outside of Rome in Frascati, to synthesise all of the material that had come. And there were, of the 114 countries that have the Catholic Church operating with them, 112 sent submissions, and there were around 1,000 submissions that came from others, such as the religious, the lay movements, some individuals, other groups with particular interests, and so on. And the result of that process, a 3-week intensive process, was the document that was called very simply at one level, the document for the continental stage, with the heading, "Widen the space of your tents," taken from Isaiah, that notion of being an open, inclusive church that can widen its space and involve others, involve more. So that document was released in October, and then there was a more concise period of discernment that happened at the regional or continental level. The Church divides the world into 7 continents, one of which is the Eastern Catholic churches, and our region is Oceania. So we went through, in a moment I'll explain our process for you, but just while we're looking at the overall process, the 31st of March this year was the deadline for submissions from each of the regions. And then in the period April to June, there was a small group of around, I think in the end it was about 17 people gathered in Rome, and 2 of us were asked to contribute remotely to another exercise, synthesising the material that had come from the 7 continents, bearing in mind that what the 7 continents were asked to do was to discern more deeply on what had come from the global consultation. Now, there's been some really very significant announcements in relation to this particular assembly, because, as I said, normally there is some process of targeted consultation, but nothing like the global consultation that has occurred for the Synod on Synodality. The Pope has also announced that instead of the usual process of 1 assembly, there will be 2 this time. There'll be another one in 24, October 24 again. And the intent is that the deliberations that come from the October 23 assembly are then fed back to the local churches for further commentary, and then that will inform what happens at the 24 assembly. And the outcomes of that assembly will go to the Pope then for his discernment and deliberation and ultimately decision. In addition, other changes are that the religious will be formally participating through their international bodies. 5 religious women and 5 religious men will be participating and voting. And then in another very significant move, the Pope asked that there be 10 people from each continent, at least half women, to participate and vote. So that's very significant. When you look then at the makeup of the Assembly in October, particularly the fact that the additional people who will be coming will be voting. They'll be deliberating and voting along with the bishops. And then the other change is that for the first time, facilitators will be used, and that is because there will be small group as well as plenary meetings. So there's been a focus on plenaries in the past, but in the small groups, the method of the spiritual conversation will be used. And there's 5 of us going from Australia. If we look at the next slide, we'll get some sense of where just a summary of what I've just spoken about, the local stage, the continental stage, and now moving to the universal stage. And then the next slide, we'll look again at the notion of that working document from the synthesis for the first stage, in other words, the deeper discernment, as I mentioned, but it was through the prism of the context. So in Oceania, we looked at it from the lived experience of Catholics in our region. And our region is Australia, New Zealand, PNG, Solomon Islands, and then the Pacific. And then additional spiritual conversation. If we move to the next slide. Can we have the next slide? Lovely. All right. So when we look at the involvement from Oceania, I think you'll see that we're very well represented, and the people who've been listed there are the people who will go as members. They will be the people who will be voting, participating, discerning, deliberating, and voting. So you can see there's I think a diversity of people who will be involved. If we look at the next slide, you'll see we're also very well represented. Very significantly, the Pope has appointed 11 people who will be delegated presidents. He is the president of the Assembly, and then there is the 2 cardinals who are involved, the prefect of the Synod of Bishops, Cardinal Mario Grech, and then Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, who will be the moderator, or the word that's used in the Vatican is the relator for the Synod. But Archbishop Costello is really a very significant participant and organiser of this assembly. Then we have Archbishop Anthony Fisher. He's a member of the council that oversees the Synod Secretariat, and he will be there in that capacity. It's the Council of Ordinaries. And then Bishop Anthony Randazzo, who's the recently appointed chair of our local Oceania Federation of Bishops, which is called the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Oceania. And from Australia, the ACCCR, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, voted that they be represented by Archbishop Pat O'Regan of Adelaide and Bishop Shane McKinley from the Sandhurst Diocese in Victoria. And then you can see the other New Zealand, Pacific and PNG nominees of their episcopal conferences. And then from Australia, we have experts and facilitators. They're listed there, Sandy Cornish, Ian Cribb, and myself, and Dr. Orm Rush. So significant representation from our region. If we move along, the next slide. Now, looking at what happened here in Oceania, and I am conscious of time, we want to make sure we've got enough time for everybody to ask questions, who wants to. The way that it worked in Oceania, when we got that document for the continental stage, each of the 4 Episcopal conferences in our region, as well as the Eastern Catholic churches, nominated 3 people to be part of a week-long discernment process in January. And you can see the image of the people who were involved there. In addition, Archbishop Comensoli's there. We had Mass every day, and he said Mass for us one day. We used the method of the spiritual conversation led by Brother Ian Cribb, who is an expert in this area. If we have time in questions, I can speak a little bit more about that process. I think in summary, we could say it's a very prayerful process. It requires a lot of preparation in terms of reading the submissions, reflecting upon them, discerning yourself before you get there, and then discerning as a group. We then drafted a submission for the consideration of a pre-organised Bishops' Assembly in Suva. It had been delayed by the pandemic, and so that went ahead in Suva, and we presented to that meeting of all of the bishops from our region. They provided a reflection of their own, in addition to what had come through from the process of drafting the document for them. And then there was, of course, some modification based on their consideration of the document at that bishops' meeting in Suva. I might say nothing that in any way adjusted what had come through the discernment from the local churches. And then finally, the Federation of Catholic Bishops' Conference of Oceania validated that document in March, and it was sent on to the Synod Secretariat. But I'm happy to speak in more detail during the questions if you want. The next slide, please. That just gives you an image of the meeting in Suva. You can see a very large group there, as well as there were 4 of us who went from the group of writers, and we did the writing and drafting while we were there. Moving to the next slide. So what did we find had come through the discernment in Oceania, bearing in mind that it was a discernment on the document from the continental stage, in other words, on what had come through the global consultation. You can see the chapters listed on the left-hand side there, and I'm sure you're aware, but you will be getting a recording of this, so you'll be able to go back and look at the detail of this if you want. You can see the priorities that emerged from that discernment process on the right-hand side. You can also see a link to the full document if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. But you can see that the notion of mission and continuing as a mission church emerged. The ecological crisis was very prominent in our region, and unsurprisingly, because it is an existential issue for our sisters and brothers in the Pacific, with rising sea levels and other impacts. There was the issue of church teaching and an urging of those at the Assembly to consider referrals for any aspects of church teaching that might be barriers to becoming a more synodal church. There was the consideration of the ways in which we can become more synodal. What are the structures, the systems and the processes that we need to address? There was the issue of authority and decision-making, which is a related issue. As was the case in the document for the continental stage, and from really pretty much every submission that came through the global church, the absence of young people and the poorer inclusion of women were very significant issues. And then finally, formation and the need for formation if we are to become a truly synodal church. Moving on to the next slide. So the Instrumentum Laboris, now again, there's a link to it there. It's the working document. It's an aid for the Assembly and part of the unfinished process. It's very clear to say at the start, It's not the first draft, as happens in some global meetings. In effect, you're finessing a pre-existing document, but it's the basis for the members, and this is a quote, to listen deeply to the situations in which the church lives and carries out its mission across the world. So it's to be based on dialogue and circularity. And that notion of circularity is that you take back to the local churches the deliberations that happen in the global church. For those of you who've had a look at it, you'll notice it's organised in fairly short chapters, and then there are the worksheets that will be used in the Assembly in October. They are the questions that the Assembly members will be asked to discern upon while trying to maintain an overview and identify practical steps. And that's important too, that the intent that this result in practical steps. If we move on again to the next slide. So looking a bit more at this instrumentum laboris, and I've taken the italicised bits, direct quotes from the chapter, the paragraphs that are listed beside it. Very strong in the document that a synodal church is a listening church. It's based on the model of Jesus listening. And as a quote, synodality appears first and foremost as a dynamism, animating concrete local communities in a dynamism of authentic Catholicity. Pope Francis has mentioned many times that baptism is our identity card. Baptism confers a co-responsibility on all members of the church and is a dimension of the church since its origins. But noting that we've not always lived in the constitutive synodal dimensions of the ecclesial community. That's all of the church community. A characteristic of a synodal church is being able to maintain tensions without being crushed by them as we encounter restlessness and incompleteness. And that certainly came through both stages of the consultation to date. The process of the spiritual conversation enables listening to one another, making space for the Holy Spirit, who is the authentic protagonist. And it's very important, I think, that both in the sessions in the local churches, but as we get to the global assembly, that is seen to be the case. And the three priorities, of course, are what was foreshadowed with the opening of the Synod: communion, mission, and participation. Next slide. Communion. So looking very quickly now, all issues are going to be addressed from the perspective of theology and canon law, as well as pastoral care and spirituality. I think that's very important. So it's not just about rules, it's about how we live as Catholics. It notes that communion is a gift and a task from a triune God, that we build the we of the people of God, not the I, the we. And a synodal assembly is analogous to a liturgical assembly where we invoke the Holy Spirit, we profess our faith, and we arrive at a shared view. And our first challenge is going to be able to live unity in diversity. I think you'll see this comes through very strongly. How do we remain one church while acknowledging the cultures, the traditions, the contexts in which the church is lived throughout the world? And this concerns the question of whether there are limits to our willingness to welcome people and groups, how to engage in dialogue with cultures and religions without compromising our identity, and our determination to be the voice of those on the margins and reaffirm that no one should be left behind. Move on then to the next slide. Mission. It's clear that mission is not the marketing of a religious product, but the construction of a community. The second priority identified by a church that discovers itself as missionary and synodal concerns the manner in which it's able to solicit the contributions of all, each with their gifts and roles, valuing the diversity of charisms and integrating the relationship between hierarchical and charismatic gifts. Significantly, all points of view have something to contribute, starting with the poor and excluded. We need to consider the baptismal dignity of women. Moving to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. And the final one, participation. So participation is essentially an expression of creativity, a way of nurturing the relationships of hospitality, welcome, and well-being that lies at the heart of mission and communion. When you think about whether it's celebration of Eucharist or other ways of being church, that notion of hospitality and welcome is very important, particularly, I think, welcome. The third priority addresses the question of authority, its meaning and the style of its exercise within a synodal church. In particular, does authority arise as a form of power derived from models offered by the world, or is it rooted in service? A service to the uniqueness of each person, supporting creativity rather than being a form of control. Formation is the indispensable means to make the synodal way of proceeding a pastoral model for the church's life and action. And there was certainly consensus on this in all of the submissions that came through the 7 continents. Next slide, please. So I just want to very briefly mention that if we look back, we can go back as far as 65 on the decree of the apostolate of the laity, or the letter that Pope Francis wrote to the people of God in 2018. It's making it clear that the laity are authorised to speak, but we have over time developed cultures and structures that have made that very difficult. And part of the focus of synodality is reanimating the voice of the laity. Next slide, please. I wanted to mention synodality within Australia, of course our own plenary council, which has been very significant, but the sentence that which I've italicised, we invite you to walk with us. So in the Uluru Statement, that's the final sentence, it's very evocative of the notion of synodality, pilgrim people walking together, wanting to understand one another and be one together. And next slide, thank you. And this is the final slide. I just want to make some observations. Pope Francis is very personally invested in this. The idea of a synodal church is very much driven by him and the work carried out through the Secretariat of the Synod of Bishops. I think there's a symbiosis between what the Pope is asking in the General Secretariat for the Synod, and you see that in the work that's come through. What we're seeing with this Synod is a reanimation of scriptural studies, theology and ecclesiology, taking note, particularly rediscovering the synodal past in the life of the church. It's a fairly organic way of planning, and I've come to realise that the Vatican's highly reliant on volunteers. You saw the list of people earlier on, but who can get involved, but who come with a disposition of accompaniment, walking with those who want to be part of this synodal movement. But we're realists, we know it's happening against the backdrop of the culture wars, which makes the method of the spiritual conversation even more important because of the process there toward finding common ground and also creating space for the Holy Spirit, who, as we noted earlier, is the chief protagonist in the Assembly. We do have fertile ground here in Oceania. As I mentioned, the Plenary Council, particularly in PNG and the Solomons and the Pacific, the basic Christian communities are alive and working well. We have our First Nations people and their own journey through the Uluru Statement. And finally, the Assembly will be, this one in October 23 and then in 24, will be quite unique in terms of the involvement of women, the involvement of laity, the voting of non-episcopal members, and I think the sense of energy and momentum that's been developed through it. But I'll leave it at that and look forward to comments and questions in the latter part of the presentation. Thank you.
Now that I am unmuted, my apologies. You'd think by now with all the Zooms we've done over the last 3 years, you would notice when you weren't mute, but never mind. Thank you so much, Susan, for what was a masterly summary of an extraordinarily complex and layered process. And we're already getting a number of questions around that, which we'll deal with at the end. I just would like to encourage everyone to make use of the Q&A function, and just to point out that the chat is disabled at this time. We're not using that tonight. We're just using the Q&A to make sure we're all in the same place. I would now like to introduce Susan Sullivan as our next speaker. Susan has worked in executive mission leadership roles over the past 2 decades. She's currently a director of Mary Mead Catholic Care in the Canberra and Goulburn Archdiocese. She was invited, most notably, to attend the final session of the German Synodal Way in March this year. Her observations and reflections are extremely valuable as we all consider our responses to the Instrumentum Laboris. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Agnes, and greetings to all of our participants wherever you find yourselves this Thursday evening. And thank you to Susie for your very fine introduction to the process and the stages that have preceded this October Synod 2023 and following in 2024. As Agnes said, I was privileged to attend the final assembly of the German Synodal Way in March of this year. And I'm acutely aware that the German Synodal Way has provoked considerable controversy, especially at the Vatican level, primarily around concerns that the proposed outcomes pose the risk of schism. So for that reason, my reflections on the Instrumentum Laboris and preparations for the Synod on Synodality will reference my observations of the German Synodal Way, as well as our own plenary council. In reading the Instrumentum Laboris, I encountered what I felt was quite an extraordinary document. Now, I'm just questioning whether we've got our slides going. Here we go. Okay, they're coming up now. Thank you, James. Thank you. The document is, I think, extraordinary, both in its tone and style, emerging as it does from the Vatican, which is better known for its formal and opaque language, and also in its intended purpose, explicitly to be a roadmap for the conduct of the October Synods. In the Instrumentum Laboris, we have an accessible, theologically rich, and spiritually nourishing document. I believe it's responded to the various developmental stages that Susie has just outlined for us to cover a wide range of themes relevant to all corners of the global church. I'm going to limit my comments to those areas of the document that I see as most significant at this moment in time for the Australian Church and our own local path towards renewal, as well as those that stand out to me as germane to how we travel this path more faithfully and effectively. So in reading the document, I immediately resonated with the articulated aim of the upcoming synods, which is to continue to animate the synodal process in the ordinary life of the church, not to produce documents, but to open horizons of hope for the fulfillment of the church's mission. This immediately reminded me of what I heard at the German Synodal Way in the words of the co-chair, Bishop Georg Betzing, where he said delegates are encouraged to be a prophetic voice, taking us into the reality of the world, whereby we get touched by the gospel and find ever new ways how to live the gospel. Most encouragingly, the Instrumentum Laboris then immediately locates its vision and purpose in the context of the pressing challenges facing the world today. It references war, the threat of climate change, economic systems that produce exploitation, inequality, a throwaway culture, and the impact of cultural colonialism that crushes minorities. The document then references the cry of local churches to be equipped to address urgent social realities. In this introduction, I hear the nuance that in gathering to reflect on the experience of the church, the starting point is all that is going on around the church that impels us towards a revitalized response and a revitalized commitment to mission. This to me is not the voice of an inward-looking church, primarily preoccupied with its own structures, processes, tensions, and challenges. Further, the Instrumentum Laboris makes clear that the synodal processes to date have affirmed the value and efficacy of synodality. It leaves the reader in no doubt that synodality is the way forward and is here to stay. So pay attention. We all need to get on board. Yet for many, synodality is still a new and abstract reality. And while theologians and the document itself assures us that synodality is in fact a retrieval of past ways of being church, nevertheless, there's significant work to be done to uncover these treasures of the tradition. For many of us, synodality is an unfamiliar word, and the practice of synodality even more so. In this context, the Instrumentum Laboris sets out to clarify the characteristics of synodality and the processes required to grow into this way of being church. So rather than focusing on simply intellectualizing the concept of synodality, we have in the document a guide to the journey and a horizon towards which we can move with confidence. To me, this approach reflects the words of the spiritual writer Henri Nouwen when he said, "You don't think your way into a new kind of living. You live your way into a new kind of thinking." So to this end, the Instrumentum Laboris offers a set of characteristics of synodality. And walking together is the unifying theme of all these characteristics. Importantly, the document asserts that synodality is our identity and vocation. So much of my professional life has been threaded through with the question, wherein lies Catholic identity? I believe that the Instrumentum Laboris is offering us rich and practical guidance on where our identity as Catholics truly lies. I'm going to examine these characteristics briefly because they are relevant for their implications as to how we live our way into being a synodal church. So the first characteristic, in a synodal church, we recognize that we share a common dignity based in baptism. We are family, and together we are responsible for this church and its mission, which is to make the gospel alive and vibrant in today's world. We're talking about co-responsibility, another word that we are growing in familiarity with. And I hear in this the essential challenge to be adults in relationship to the church. So for all of us gathered here tonight, as well as for all of those whose lives we connect with, how do you take up this challenge? Second characteristic, in a synodal church, this co-responsibility is reflected in its structures, processes, and procedures, where authority is a form of service rather than an exercise of power. Now, this element of church has been the subject of considerable examination, both through the report of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse, in the Light from the Southern Cross report, in deliberations of the Australian Plenary Council, and through many forms of advocacy by groups such as the Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Renewal, who are hosting our event tonight. We need to continue to pursue all mechanisms for ensuring accountability for this intent articulated in the document to implement reforms in this area of structures, processes, and procedures. Third characteristic, a synodal church listens. In the words of the Instrumentum Laboris, the experience of being listened to by the community, in some cases for the first time, offers a recognition of the person's unique worth. And here I'm deeply aware of the resonance with the Sex Abuse Royal Commission and the opportunity it provided for victim survivors to be heard, and the irreplaceable impact of being heard, that being heard offered. And I'm also drawn for its deep relevance to the soul searching going on within our own country at present around the cry of Indigenous people to be heard. How are we in the Australian Catholic Church living the call to synodality in practical ways for both these groups of people so that they be listened to and heard? So I think the challenge of synodality is a way of being that reaches beyond church boundaries and into our world as well. I'm also reminded in this element here of my experience in Germany, where it was clear that the formal engagement between the lay and clerical arms of church life has clearly delivered vibrant and respectful exchange on matters of human life and society and their relationship to the mission of the church in an ever-changing world. Listening across different perspectives has contributed to reducing the risk in Germany of insularity and the associated irrelevance of the church hierarchy. That was my experience in March at that event. The fourth characteristic, a synodal church is humble, knowing that it must ask forgiveness and has much to learn, especially from the crises related to sex abuse, the abuse of power, money, and conscience. I'll say that again. A synodal church has much to learn, especially from the crises related to sex abuse, abuse of power, money, and conscience. I'm particularly drawn to the fourth of these examples, conscience, which seems to me to be an unexpected ownership of the damage to the lives of individuals and their faith journey by a church that de facto has claimed to have all the answers and knows best what is required to live a faith-filled moral life. The fifth characteristic, a synodal church is a place of encounter and dialogue with other religions, cultures, and societies. It values diversity without forcing uniformity. These characteristics of synodality were strongly in evidence at the German Synodal Way assembly that I attended, in particular, the listening, dialogue, and encounter. At that assembly, the issues around sexuality were confronted frankly and directly. And these reflect the same issues that have been articulated in Australia. Yet, to me, it was astonishing and humbling in Germany to listen to the contributions of people who identify as transgender and gay, actually addressing the assembly in a confident and unapologetic way. There was also witness through encounter and dialogue to an openness by the bishops to name hard issues in a public forum. There I heard a real candidness from the bishops and an honesty about what is really happening in the church. For example, on the issue of obligatory celibacy, there was a refreshing honesty that the present situation of declining numbers of priestly vocations is unsustainable. Sixth characteristic, the Instrumentum Laboris affirms unequivocally. It says, the synodal process has been an opportunity to begin to learn what it means to live unity in diversity. This is a movement of authentic Catholicity. So unity in diversity is a movement of authentic Catholicity. Back to our sense of Catholic identity. I hear this as a highly significant statement, and it takes me back to my conclusions after attending the German Synodal Way, where I became convinced that unity in diversity is central to the success of synodality. Seventh, a synodal dynamic is to recognize the shared questions as well as shared tensions. Speaking to the imperative of finding unity and diversity, this characteristic acknowledges the challenge of managing inevitable tensions. Yet, refreshingly, the document frames the reality of tensions as having the potential to be sources of energy rather than destructive polarizations. I think that's very significant. The eighth characteristic, a synodal church embraces a healthy restlessness of incompleteness and is able to live the questions, listening with attention without rushing to solutions. Can you hear this? I should repeat it, I think, because it is important. A synodal church embraces a healthy restlessness of incompleteness. This is not the model of church we're accustomed to, or a church proclaiming itself as a perfect society and a model for how the faithful and indeed the world should live. Rather, in this characteristic, I hear the echoes of contemplative spirituality, which invites us to find in our incompleteness the way to deeper union with God. Ninth, members of a synodal church accept their own vulnerabilities as the space for the action of the Spirit. Here too are the echoes of contemplative spirituality and the call to a spiritual journey of letting go of the certainties of ego in order to grow into our true self and so become united more deeply with the divine. I can't help but notice too that such wisdom beckons from the many art forms expressive of this human quest, including the songs of Leonard Cohen, who sings, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Lastly, the Instrumentum Laboris situates a synodal church as a place of discernment, and this becomes the lens for the practical second half of the document, the roadmap to becoming synodal. And I'd like to briefly examine part 2 of the document, which is titled A Working Tool for the Second Phase. The Instrumentum Laboris is designed as a practical aid for the conduct of the Synodal Assembly in October 23 and 24, and to serve its ultimate task of discerning the concrete steps to enable continued growth of a synodal church. This way forward to becoming a synodal church is characterized as conversation in the Spirit, which the document reminds us is part of the long tradition of ecclesial discernment. Now, we all vary in our comfort with and tolerance of variety and diversity, but the practice of discernment helps us face up to and address the barriers to synodality through cultivating self-awareness and the practice of non-reactivity. Discernment means noticing the instincts driving me or driving us if we're in a group, and encourages us to first reflect before responding, to avoid closing down to the other and their experience, and to avoid being reactive. So I'd like to spend a few minutes reflecting on the discernment steps because of their relevance to our own opportunity to get on board with becoming a synodal church by assisting our way of relating as church, as families, as communities, and even as a nation. Through the words spoken and heard, people grow in familiarity with one another, and this enables them to draw closer to one another. Hopefully, we can all relate to this very human experience of the power of speaking and being heard in what we have to say. So discernment is a spiritual practice with a missionary intent, that is, an outward-looking intent, enabling us to move from I to we, while never losing sight of the personal dimension. It recognises the community dimension to which we essentially all belong. Now, the actual first step in the preparation for a discernment process and a dialogue always involves informing oneself and preparing to understand and address the question or questions at hand. And that's the first stage of the Synod in October 2023 that has been nourished by all those documents that Susie has mentioned in her presentation. So there's been a lot of preparation for the participants at the Synod to really understand the questions, to hear the experience of the people, of the faithful in all of the corners of the globe. So then when we come to the in-person encounter, in this case, the Synod, the first step will be for each person to take the floor, starting from his or her own experience, which they will have listened to and reread in prayer during the preparation period. Others listen in the knowledge that each person has a valuable contribution to offer and refrains from debate or discussion. The second step in the in-person encounter, other people take the floor, not to be reactive or to counter what they've heard or to reaffirm and state their own position, but to express from what they have heard, from their listening, what has touched them deeply and what they feel challenged by most strongly. Now, this is a call to a place of deep respect and self-awareness in order to identify within oneself lies both resonance and resistance to what is heard. It's a deeply spiritual process, and it requires all the virtues of the spiritual life. Then the third step, after the listening phase, the next step is to identify the key points that have emerged and to build a consensus on the fruits of the dialogue and the work that might follow, so that each person feels that what emerges is faithful to the process and they feel represented. It is not enough to draw up a report listing the most often mentioned points. Rather, it pays attention to marginal and prophetic voices. So that's the concept of building consensus through really listening deeply and drawing out from the process what has been shared in the conversation. Now, after articulating those steps of discernment, the Instrumentum Laboris concludes with an emphasis on the importance of formation in this method, and in particular, formation of facilitators who are capable of accompanying communities in the practice of this method. And it's clear to me that formation is perceived as a priority at all levels of ecclesial life through what has been prepared in this document, that all the baptized, starting with ordained ministers, have the opportunity to learn this process of discernment, and so practice it in a way that enables genuine exchange to take place. So, sorry, just lost my place here. I see the opportunity in these practical steps that we've just outlined for each of us to meaningfully assume co-responsibility for walking this synodal path. And so by implication, we need to be serious about investing in the necessary formation suggested by the Instrumentum Laboris to progress a truly synodal church. And in conclusion, I'd like to offer an invitation to each of you listening tonight. How might we respond? Might we each reflect on our touch points with church, as many and varied as they are, and bring to them the steps towards a meaningful encounter offered here in these steps, along with the disposition they require that is reflected in each of the 10 characteristics of synodality that I've described this evening. And as implied by the outset of the document, can we bring this process of discernment, of encounter and dialogue through listening and hearing, can we bring these steps to the social realities in which we are all currently immersed as families, as communities, as a nation? We are each responsible. Or to quote the Instrumentum Laboris, whenever we encounter another person in love, we learn something new about God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that very inspiring overview. I'd like now to move to some of the questions that we've been posted, and beginning with Susan P. There's a number of questions that are concerned about inclusion, which I think is quite interesting, ranging from how many people are going to be able to vote, to why hasn't the Synod also included lay movements such as St Vincent de Paul, especially international lay movements? What's been the role of First Nations people, young people, and those disengaged from the church? And I think overall it's a question about how inclusive has the process been and how many voices are being heard.
Thank you, and a really important issue. I think at the first stage, that was from October 21 to August 22, that was an open invitation to absolutely anybody. So that was, if you like, a very inclusive stage. Almost inevitably, when you got to the next stage, there was a bit of a distillation. Again, it was an open invitation for the discernment on the document on the continental stage within the diocese, but there were inevitably, I think, fewer people involved. And then as we go to the Synod itself, to the assembly, the Synod assembly itself, if I could just by reference to past assemblies, the composition of assemblies in terms of the episcopal members is that depending on the number of Catholics in their country, they get to have one delegate, two delegates, more delegates. So those episcopal delegates are chosen on that basis. The notion of the additional people this time, the 5 religious women and men, was an initiative of the Pope, and it was long seen, I think, an oversight that they didn't have a voice. Religious men had been able to observe in the past, but not vote. And the 10 people from each of the continents is really very significant, and particularly that they, at least half of them, be women. I think it's inevitable that you won't get everybody. I understand that the lay movements could have been better represented. I think that that's a fair comment. And certainly in future synods, we may see a greater involvement of women. But for a first step, in terms of this not being just a bishop's meeting, this being the broader church, I think it's a very significant first step. But noting, particularly because the critique of the fact that the church doesn't have a practice of recognising and including the gifts of women to the same extent of men, I think is again an understandable critique. Thanks, Agnes. I'm happy to elaborate further if people would like.
Thanks. Just following that up with Susan Sullivan, we had a question. I have a question about why were young people and the laity so well represented in Germany? Are they just much more involved, or was that part of how the process worked?
Yes, look, I think that's a really interesting question, and it was one that really intrigued me as well. When I attended the assembly, there were about 210 delegates gathered in the room, and when I looked around the room, I saw a much younger age profile to what I would have expected to see in Australia at a similar meeting. And the answer I came up with, and I tested this out with a number of people that I was privileged to meet while I was in Germany. There has been a long-standing organisation in Germany called the Central Committee for Catholics, Central Committee for Lay Catholics, or something like that. And that has had its own authority, its own organisation for probably a century and a half. And it's comprised of interesting organisations, including the kind of things you would never find in Australia. Something, I think that I met someone who was representing the Association for German Engineers. So really ordinary gatherings of Catholics, if you like, that still, for whatever reason, have remained engaged. Maybe the reason being that they have this platform from which they can be engaged, this central committee, which, as you may be aware, the German Assembly was co-chaired by the bishop and by the lay president, the president of the lay committee. And I think it's the fact of having that very strong lay committee that the bishops have engaged with over a century and a half, that have come from all walks of life and have had strong representation as a voice within the German church, that there is a much stronger representation of young people. That's my assessment anyway.
Thank you. And just continuing on with you for a moment, Susan, because it's the next question coming up. Many of our priests and bishops in the church have been formed in a hierarchical and clerical model of decision-making. So that our questioner sees that as a significant obstacle to implementation of synodality. And perhaps both of you would like to comment on this. How do we overcome that? First of all, do you see it as an obstacle? And secondly, if so, how might it be overcome?
Well, let me just continue, then I'll follow and allow Susie to answer. I think there certainly has been a concern expressed about perhaps a disengagement at some levels of the clergy and even some bishops' conferences around the world. I think we have to face up to that as a potential barrier. On the other hand, I think if we listen deeply to what the document is telling us about the process of engagement, if we learn those processes as lay people, if we develop confidence in implementing those processes for encounter and dialogue, perhaps we can bring some of the clergy along more companionably, and pose ourselves in our dialogue as not attempting to be a threat, but as attempting to be a genuine encounter between people. So I would just draw, I suppose, from the principles that I've articulated already in terms of how we conduct our relationship with people for whom we may feel some barriers and some difficulties in conversation.
I think I'd add, I agree with that. And I'd add, if you look at some of the documents that have come through the International Theological Commission that have looked at synodality, and on that, the other notion of sensus fidei, the notion of when people in good faith come together and reflect that they cannot err. And so these are ways in which there's if you like, a countervailing force. So, for example, if you were to look at the structure of some of the key documents from Vatican II, they put service, although they're within a hierarchical church, but it's the church, then it's the people of God, then the bishops. So you're looking at what some writers and the Pope himself sometimes refers to, the notion of the inverted pyramid, where you actually have the service is there for the people of God. Very much reflected in many of the writings that have been associated with the work of the Synod so far is the notion that the bishop really must listen to the voices of the people, that the bishop can't come to informed decision-making if he's not listening to the voices of the people. So almost an imperative that to undertake effective decision-making, that's an important stance or approach that the bishop must take. So I think there are ways in which we can see that perhaps there are structures and there are practices, but I think that there are ways in which, particularly as we move to being a more synodal church, and to pick up Susan Sullivan's challenge, if we accept that we're co-responsible and we get engaged, then I think we will see a greater balance in the voices that are involved in the decision-making in the church.
Thank you. One of our questioners would like to know what either of you think about where is the prophetic voice in the synodal process?
Look, I've read many of I've got to confess, the English submissions from the first stage, and I've read all of the submissions from the second stage. And in the discernment process in Frascati, we were operating in a couple of languages, and so, got to see a lot more. There's the prophetic voices are coming through from the grassroots. There's extraordinary animation in the life of the church. There's a raw honesty. There's a love and a commitment for the church, a connection to the church, and it's there. So if you talk prophetic, Agnes, I don't think that we necessarily are saying it's got to be an opinion leader, an existing opinion leader. I think many of the prophetic voices are there. And if I go back to that slide that took us back to 65 and the apostolate of the laity, as well as 2018 and Pope Francis, they're effectively authorising the laity. Like, you have a voice, use your voice. And I think that that's part of it, that we, for those of us that are, post-war, baby boomers and the like, we grew up in a church where the pay, pray and obey model was dominant, but we're really being invited to take a more active, co-responsible approach.
And I would probably add to that, if we really understand what a prophetic voice means, a prophetic voice inspires us to a vision and a new way of seeing. And I would say that there's many aspects of the instrumentum laboris that is itself inspiring us to a new way of seeing, a new vision. I see the document in that space of being a prophetic voice itself.
That's a good point. Can I add one further point?
Yes,
that it was significant when we were gathered in Frascati that the voice of the Pacific was crying out for an ecological conversion. It was crying out for a consideration of the degradation that's happening to our oceans and our lands. And that was really very significant, because it was not a sole voice on that topic, but it was an absolutely powerful voice on that topic. And so it made its way through. And Susan gave a great description earlier of the ways in which the discernment process wants to live with the tensions and hear the voices from the margins. And that, I think, is a really good example of a very prophetic voice. And even to the second stage, when there was the meeting of the bishops in Suva, the local Archbishop, Peter Lloyd Chong, really organised a lot of experiential sessions, visits to sites and meetings with local people, so that there could be a deeper understanding of that environmental crisis. And again, they were prophetic voices, and much of it was actually through song and dance and imagery. So, I think, Agnes, there are lots of voices. I think part of it is our capacity to listen, and whether we're in that mode of being able to hear them.
A couple more things. Thank you for that. Susan P, a question. Can you tell us a bit more about Together Gathering of the People of God on the 30th of September? And what is Australia's involvement?
So this is an ecumenical prayer service to precede the formal opening of the Synod. The Synod's opening on the 4th of October, but in fact there's also to be I think a form of retreat from the 1st to the 3rd. But Pope Francis has invited people in person to Rome, and particularly young people, and particularly with an ecumenical focus, to pray together. So that's really the intent of that. And I think it's a Saturday. I think it's a weekend day. But the invitation isn't only to people who can be physically present in Rome, but to replicate the intent around the globe.
Thank you. Just again, before we move off, Susan, someone asking, is the church's relationship between science and religion being dealt with in any way?
It hasn't emerged through the consultation process as a major issue. I think the one area where there may be some discussion is the social sciences, if you like, and the psychology, because certainly in all of the submissions that I've read, a deeper understanding of human sexuality was there in relation to particularly LGBTQI plus. That was certainly there, and in some of the submissions, I'm now talking about from the first stage of consultation, a really deep distress at the particularly, I think, the wording in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that being gay is being intrinsically disordered. That's just caused extreme distress. So I think that also, I might add, was an issue in Oceania, the issue of LGBTQI+. It's a really significant issue with youth, and it's identified as one of the barriers for youth. So the issue of the LGBTQI+, but that sense of the issue of some groups being excluded. And so that notion, I think if you had to summarise what came through the first stage of consultation, where you could say there was consensus across the world, everybody wants a more welcoming, inclusive and participatory church. Now, I know the question was about science and religion, but I think it's social sciences, that where the connection is, and that's clearly that's a matter of high sensitivity in terms of church teaching.
Susan, would you want to add anything to that?
Only that when I was in Germany at the assembly in Frankfurt, that was the other thing that really impressed me. The various proposals that were put forward were presented in the context of very deep scientific research. They had professors in their areas of expertise, particularly in relation to the LGBTQI+ question, presenting, the latest understanding of that reality. So yes, I certainly found that to be the case at the German Assembly.
And I suppose somewhat related to this, although not directly, there have been a couple of comments and questions about how the Synod is dealing with the sexual abuse crisis.
I think Susan Sullivan made reference to the fact that if you read the opening of the Instrumentum Laboris, it's very frank about the situation in which the Church finds itself. And this is my own analysis, I do think that for Pope Francis, part of the momentum for synodality is a view that some of the systems and structures that the Church has in place have enabled systemic abuse. And of course, that's what our own Royal Commission here in Australia found. And so if you think about it, particularly the analysis of Australia's own Royal Commission, it wasn't claiming causal connections between some of those, but alluding to them as contextual factors that did appear to be contributing factors, such as a lack of transparency and accountability, the hierarchical structures, the celibacy, and so on. So, as I say, no one's saying that they're necessarily causal, but they're certainly contextual, and they're certainly part of the environment, which is the part of the broader discussion. It did come through very strongly, I might add, in the first phase of consultation. The notion that the vocation to priesthood in all of its manifestations warranted further investigation. So from the stages of selection and formation in seminary training, and then post-seminary training, and the requirements of priesthood, all of those came through, and a sense that they really did need to be examined.
Thank you.
And I'll echo that, what Susie has had to say, that there's a section of the document that actually explicitly says that we need to exercise justice as a form of care for those who have been wounded by members of the Church, especially victims and survivors of all forms of abuse. And really threaded through the document are many references to the sex abuse crisis and the need to address the consequences of that.
Thank you. One of our listeners would ask either of you or both of you if you feel confident that the Synod can take the Australian Church beyond what has largely been the disappointments and lack of action after the plenary.
Well, oh no, I mean, I think the person to answer this would be Orm Rush. Some of you would know Father Orm Rush, who's an expert on Vatican II, and he's also written on the reception of the teachings of Vatican II, particularly in the Pacific, but also in Australia. And look, at the end of the day, you need receptive leaders. It's like any change, whether it's change in the Church or change elsewhere. And so we do. I think the fact that Australia initiated a plenary council and, I got on with it, I think that is a positive. Now, whether the pace of change is where people would like to see it, that's another story. In terms of the global Church, I just make one reflection, and that is that the Church in Africa and Asia has many differences to the Church in Australia. And while we, were distressed about the non-inclusion of women, there there was one session I went to where there was upset about the non-inclusion of men, and trying to be as synodal as I could, I said, well, you know, can you please explain further what do you mean by that? Well, because of the practice of polygamy, men then absent themselves from church. And so this is seen to be a, you know, like that was a cause of some distress, whereas for we are much more focused on the non-inclusion of women. So I just make that point that, and Susan Sullivan made the point earlier about unity and diversity. The pace at which a global church can move is somewhat modified by, you know, taking account of all of the contexts in which we're a developed, wealthy nation, where women have high levels of participation in areas of civil life. And so the contrast to the low levels of participation in church life is much starker than in some other countries. So I just say that by way of, not to be an apologist, but by way of explanation.
Thank you.
And I guess I would add to that, thank you, Susie. I think hope is one of the most important virtues of the spiritual life. And it's just essential, isn't it, to being human? And if we talk about being a faith-filled people, we believe and hope in the Spirit. I would also say that we need to, going back to a point I made in my presentation about being adults in the church, we need to look to ourselves and our communities of faith and contribute to how we become this church and become the church that we want to see. You know, that classic sort of Gandhi statement, be the change that you want to see. And we have to be ripples of that hope. I hope that everyone listening tonight goes away and thinks about, what can I contribute? Because it's through all of those ripples that change occurs. And we can't always look to what's happening at a global and institutional hierarchical level to find the church that we want to be part of. We have to contribute to bring it alive in our circumstances where we find ourselves.
Thank you. We could go on, I think, a great deal longer, but we must not. I would like to finish with a comment from the question page, which really invited more comment, but we don't have time. The leadership of women is patently obvious tonight. Thank you, Susan and Susan. Your style, experience, presentation skills and knowledge make it patently clear that the current church, without tangibly drawing upon the leadership of women, is impoverished. I think we would all agree with that tonight. I would like now to introduce for some closing words, Andrea Dean. Andrea is the President of Women and the Australian Church, and she will now join us to make some brief concluding remarks. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Agnes, and hi, everybody. I guess I've been struck this evening by, well, two key images. I think both Susan and Susan talked about a roadmap towards synodality. This whole experience is one where we're actually following the directions, we're moving to a new place. So this whole exploration of synodality is giving us a roadmap for this change. But it strikes me that it's also giving us a lens. So we're getting a new way of looking at everything. So our perspective on everything is changing. I'm struck too, I think it was last Sunday's gospel where we had weeds and wheat growing up together. And it seems a great parallel for the comment that Susan Sullivan made about how questions and tensions in this experience of church, a synodal church, questions and tensions are sources of energy. And surely we have plenty of questions and tensions, and therefore at this time enormous potential for sources of energy. I think becoming a synodal church asks us all to listen differently, not to listen as if we don't have the whole picture, but to listen as if I'm wrong, to listen as if I'm wrong. There is so much more to learn that I don't understand, to listen as if I'm wrong. I hope that makes sense to you. I don't think we're just flipping a pyramid about how we understand the church. I think we can no longer think of the church with static kind of images. I think we are now considering a church which is like a flame. It's ever burning. The shape is changing. It's just can't be captured by one photograph, by one image. It's alive. That's how the church has to be. That's how our understanding has to be. And that took me to another little story about fire, which I'd like to share in conclusion. The story comes from the desert fathers and mothers who withdrew into the deserts in order to live their spiritual life deeply. And one of the sisters or brothers went to another more experienced sister or brother and said, as much as I'm able, I follow the rule, keep my fast, do my prayers and meditation, remain quiet, and as much as possible, I live a good life. What else should I do? Then the more experienced sister or brother stood up and stretched out her hand towards heaven. Her fingers became like 10 torches of flame. And she said, why not become fire? And I think that's what the challenge is for us today. This is a time for our spiritual lives to be more than a program of following rules or doing what we've done before. It's time for a whole-souled plunge into life and into our faith. It's time for us to become completely fire. Thank you, everybody, for your contribution tonight. It's been a real pleasure to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Andrea. As always, words of wisdom to conclude. And in conclusion, on behalf of everyone, I'm sure, here tonight, I wish to thank both our speakers very much and everyone who has contributed to this stimulating evening, to the executive of ACCCR, to Garratt Publishing, and in particular to James McEwen for his, as always, ultra-professional operation of the webinar, including letting me know when I was not mute and rattling my papers, for which I apologise. I think we've all had many messages to take away from tonight. I think we will pray and try to discern from them, but we certainly have had a great deal of food for thought expressed most eloquently, and we thank you for it, both Susan. Good night.